My name is Greg, and until recently, I believed I had a pretty solid life. I'm a 42-year-old guy who's always prided himself on being the rock in the family. I've been married to Jessica for 12 years, and together we've got 2 kids. Emma, who's 10, and little Max, who's 7. Life was comfortable. No, scratch that. Life was good. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Colorado, the kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturdays and wave to each other from their driveways. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm while Jessica stayed at home with the kids. She'd given up her job as a teacher to raise them, and I respected that. I thought we were a team, that we understood each other. But it turns out I was dead wrong. Looking back now, I realized that maybe I was just being naive. You hear stories all the time about infidelity, about husbands or wives who step out of the marriage because they're bored or lonely, or whatever other excuses people like to throw around. But you never think it's going to be you, not until you're sitting there, staring at a truth you can't unsee. That's where I was just a few weeks ago, sitting in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to process the fact that the woman I'd built my life around had been screwing some other guy. It all started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. Jessica and I had always been close. Hell, we were best friends before anything else. We met in college and things just clicked. We both liked the same kind of music. We both loved hiking and camping, and we could spend hours just talking about nothing and everything. We got married after graduation, and for the most part, it was smooth sailing. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but nothing too dramatic. We always figured things out, always found a way back to each other. But in the last year or so, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Jessica started getting more distant, more wrapped up in her own world. She was always busy with the kids or some new hobby. First, it was yoga, then pottery, then this weird obsession with essential oils. I didn't think much of it. I just figured she needed an outlet. Being a stay-at-home mom is tough, and I respected that she wanted something for herself. But then she started spending more time on her phone, always texting or checking social media. Again, I didn't think much of it. Who isn't glued to their phone these days? The first real red flag came when she started going out more. "I'm meeting up with the girls," she'd say, or "I'm going to the gym." I wanted to believe her, so I did. But those girls' nights seemed to stretch later and later, and the gym trips became more frequent. I remember one night she came home around midnight smelling like she'd bathed in cheap cologne. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying some drunk guy at the bar had bumped into her. I wanted to believe that too, so I let it slide. But the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Then there was the sex, or lack of it, to be more accurate. We used to have a pretty good thing going, but lately, Jessica seemed disinterested. She'd go to bed early, claiming she was tired, or she'd make some excuse about needing to finish a book. At first, I chalked it up to stress, or maybe just a phase. I mean, we've got 2 kids, a mortgage, and all the usual pressures of life. But when weeks turned into months, and those lame excuses kept piling up, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So there I was, in the car, trying to figure out what the hell was going on with my wife. I'd never been the jealous type, but something about her behavior was gnawing at me, eating away at the trust I thought we had. I didn't want to believe she could be unfaithful. I didn't want to think that the woman I'd shared my life with for over a decade could be capable of such a betrayal. But the signs were all there, staring me in the face, daring me to do something about it. I guess that's the thing about infidelity. You don't really know what you'll do until you're in it, until you're faced with the possibility that everything you thought was real might be a lie. I could have confronted Jessica right then and there, demanded answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just plain denial. Instead, I decided to dig a little deeper, to find out the truth on my own terms. It was that decision that set everything in motion, that opened the door to the dark, twisted path my life was about to take. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. Once I started, there was no going back. If you've ever been in that moment, when the realization hits you that the person you love is hiding something, you know the feeling. It's like this sudden, icy dread settling in your gut, gnawing away at any illusions you've been clinging to. That's where I was, standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I jumped, there'd be no way to unsee the truth. But I couldn't just leave it alone. I had to know. I had to be sure. Jessica had been acting strange for months, but I hadn't let myself fully connect the dots. Maybe I didn't want to. But after that night in the car, when I let all those doubts swirl around in my head, I knew I couldn't just sit back and ignore it anymore. I started paying more attention. Subtle stuff at first. I noticed how she always seemed to be in a rush when she left the house. How she'd spend an extra 10 minutes in front of the mirror, fussing with her hair or makeup, even if she was just going to meet the girls. Then there were the phone calls. She'd step out of the room to take them, speaking in hushed tones, laughing softly at jokes I wasn't meant to hear. Whenever I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd brush it off with a dismissive, "Just Sarah," or, "It's my mom." But the vibe was different. You know how it is. You can tell when someone's hiding something, even if they're good at covering it up. Jessica wasn't just talking to her friends or her mom. She was talking to someone else. Someone she didn't want me to know about. One day, I decided to go through her phone. I'd never been that guy before, the one who snoops through his partner's things. We'd always had a pretty open relationship. No secrets, no bullshit. At least that's what I thought. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away, and I needed answers. I waited until she was in the shower. My hands were practically shaking as I picked up her phone from the nightstand. Jessica was careful, too careful. There were no suspicious texts or calls in her logs, no incriminating photos in her gallery. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a new app. One of those encrypted messaging services. It was the kind that erases your messages after a certain amount of time, so there's no trace left behind. My heart pounded as I opened it, expecting to find nothing. But there it was, a conversation that hadn't yet disappeared. The name at the top of the chat was Ben. I didn't know any Ben, and I sure as hell didn't know any Ben that Jessica would be talking to. My thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating, before I tapped on the conversation. The messages were tame at first, just small talk. But as I scrolled further up, my stomach started to churn. The tone of the conversation changed, became more flirtatious, more intimate. Ben wasn't just some friend, he was something else. And then I saw it. The kind of message that stops your heart cold. A photo, one of Jessica in her underwear, taken in our bedroom, sent to this asshole like it was nothing. "Wish you were here," she had written beneath it. The room spun, my hands clenching the phone so hard I thought it might break. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Couldn't believe this was my wife, the mother of my children, sending racy photos to some guy while I was at work, breaking my back to provide for our family. I scrolled further, my vision blurring as I read the messages that followed. There were plans to meet up, exchanges about the last time they'd been together. How much she missed his touch. How she couldn't wait until the next time. It was all there, in black and white, laid out in sickening detail. The late-night outings, the sudden interest in going to the gym, the change in her behavior. It all made sense now. She wasn't meeting up with her friends or going for a workout. She was meeting him. My first instinct was to storm into the bathroom, throw open the door, and confront her right then and there. But something held me back. I needed more than just a few messages and a photo. I needed to know how deep this went, how long it had been going on, and just how far she'd gone to deceive me. So I took a screenshot of the messages and sent them to myself, making sure to delete any trace of what I'd done from her phone. The next few days were torture. Every time I looked at Jessica, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, smiling and laughing, playing the perfect wife and mother. But I knew better. I'd watch her from across the room, studying her every move, trying to see if there were any other signs I'd missed. She was good, too good. If I hadn't found those messages, I might never have known. But now that I did know, I couldn't just sit back and let it continue. I started following her, watching her like a hawk. I'd leave work early, park down the street, and wait for her to leave the house. At first, it was just to see if she was really going where she said she was going. More often than not, she'd head straight to a bar on the other side of town, one that was out of the way, where nobody we knew would see her. She'd be there for hours, sometimes until late at night. And then, one day, I followed her to a hotel. That was the moment everything came crashing down. Seeing her walk into that hotel, knowing exactly why she was there, what she was about to do, it broke something inside me. I waited in my car for over an hour, hoping, praying, that she'd walk out alone. that I was wrong. But when she finally did come out, she wasn't alone. Ben was with her. Tall, dark hair. The kind of guy who looks like he spends more time in the gym than anywhere else. They were laughing, their hands brushing against each other as they walked to his car. And then they kissed. I sat there, watching as they made out like teenagers in the parking lot before they got into his car and drove off together. The rage that boiled up inside me was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I wanted to chase after them, to tear him apart with my bare hands. But I knew I had to be smart about this. I needed more evidence, something undeniable, something that she couldn't explain away or dismiss. So I took photos, grainy, shaky, but clear enough to show what was happening. And then I drove home, my mind spinning with thoughts of what to do next. By the time Jessica came home that night, I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She walked in like nothing was wrong, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and asked how my day was. I forced a smile, pretending that everything was fine. But inside I was seething. I couldn't believe the audacity, the sheer gall, of her acting like this was just another ordinary day. She went upstairs to shower, and I stayed on the couch, barely holding it together, thinking about how I was going to confront her with everything I had found. When she finally came back down, I was ready. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to make sure that when I did finally lay it all out, there would be no way she could deny it. No way she could wiggle out of the truth. So I waited, biding my time, gathering every bit of evidence I could. I started tracking her every move, monitoring her phone, and documenting every lie she told. The days turned into weeks, and with every passing day, I felt myself growing more detached, more numb. I was going through the motions at work, barely able to focus on anything other than the betrayal that had consumed my life. At home, I played the role of the loving husband, but inside, I was plotting, planning, figuring out exactly how I was going to bring this whole charade crashing down around her. Finally, after weeks of waiting, I had everything I needed. The texts, the photos, the hotel receipts. I had it all. There was no doubt left in my mind that Jessica had been cheating on me, and there was no way she could talk her way out of it. I was ready to confront her, to lay it all out, and watch her world crumble. I knew it wasn't going to be pretty, and I knew there was a good chance things would get ugly, but I didn't care. She'd betrayed me, betrayed our family, and she was going to pay for it. Confronting your wife about cheating isn't something you ever prepare for. There's no handbook, no set of instructions on how to handle the moment when your life as you know it is blown apart. But I knew it was time. I'd spent weeks collecting evidence, gathering every piece of dirt I could on Jessica and her sleazy affair with Ben. I had it all. Texts, photos, locations. Hell, I even knew what kind of flowers he bought her. And now, it was time to let her know that the jig was up. I waited until a Friday night. The kids were staying over at my parents' place for the weekend, so we had the house to ourselves. Perfect, I thought. No need for them to hear what was about to go down. I'd spent the entire day rehearsing in my mind how I'd approach it, but no amount of mental preparation could brace me for the real thing. Jessica came home late as usual. She was dressed to the nines. Tight black dress, heels that made her legs look like they went on forever, and that scent of perfume that used to drive me wild. Except now, that smell made me sick to my stomach. She waltzed in, phone in hand, barely looking up at me as she slipped off her shoes and tossed her purse on the table. "Hey," she said casually, as if she hadn't just spent the last few hours in bed with another man. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare." "Traffic, huh?" I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. She didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. She was too busy checking her phone, probably a message from Ben. "Yeah, it was awful. How was your day?" "My day? Oh, it was fine," I replied, standing up from the couch. "Actually, I spent it thinking." Finally, she looked up at me, probably noticing the edge in my tone. "About what?" "About us," I said, watching her closely. "About where you were tonight." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Greg, don't start. I told you, I was out with the girls." "Right," I said, nodding slowly. "The girls. Funny because I don't remember any of your friends being named Ben." Jessica froze. Her hand tightened around her phone, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But then her face twisted into that same condescending smirk she'd been wearing for months, the one that made me want to put my fist through a wall. "What the hell are you talking about, Greg? Ben? Who's Ben?" I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the file I'd been keeping, and held it out to her. The first thing she saw was a picture of her and Ben kissing in the parking lot outside the hotel. I watched as the color drained from her face, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the photos. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" I shot back. "I know everything, Jess. The texts, the hotels, the nights you said you were out with friends. I know it all, so don't even try to deny it." She stared at me, her eyes hardening as she realized there was no way out of this. But instead of breaking down, instead of apologizing or begging for forgiveness like I might have expected, she did something that made my blood run cold. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh either. It was this low, bitter chuckle, like she was finally getting to say something she'd been holding in for a long time. "You're really something, Greg," she said, shaking her head, spying on me like some pathetic little detective. "Did you think you'd catch me and I'd just fall to my knees, begging for you to take me back?" I felt my hands clench into fists, but I kept my voice calm, controlled. "I thought you might at least have the decency to admit what you've done." "Oh, please," she snapped, rolling her eyes. "Admit what? That I found someone who actually makes me feel alive? That I'm not just some bored housewife waiting around for you to come home and throw me a scrap of attention? Is that what you think?" I asked, my voice rising. "That this is my fault? That you fucking some other guy is my fault?" "Maybe it is!" she shot back, stepping closer, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to be married to a man who's never home, who cares more about his job than his wife? I tried, Greg. I tried to talk to you, to tell you how lonely I was, but you didn't listen. You never listened. And fucking Ben was your solution?" I spat, barely able to control my anger. "Screwing some guy behind my back, lying to me, to our kids, that was your way of fixing things? It was better than sitting around waiting for you to give a damn," she screamed, her face contorted in anger. "You don't get it, do you? I was miserable. I was dying inside, and you didn't even notice." Ben noticed. He made me feel wanted, alive. "Alive?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's your excuse? You felt alive? Jesus, Jessica, do you even hear yourself? You're throwing away everything we built, everything we have, for what? A quick fuck in a hotel room?" "That quick fuck is more than you ever gave me," she hissed, her voice cold, venomous. "At least he knows how to make a woman feel good." "That was it," I snapped. Without thinking, I grabbed her by the arm, pulling her close, my face inches from hers. "You really think you can justify this? You really think you can stand there and act like this is my fault? Let go of me," she said, her voice suddenly low, dangerous. "Or what?" I growled, not even sure what I was saying anymore. The rage, the betrayal, it all boiled over, and I could barely see straight. "Or I'll call the police," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "You want them to see these bruises, Greg? Want them to see what a monster you really are?" I let go of her arm, shoving her back. "You're unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. "After everything, you still think you're the victim." She rubbed her arm where I'd grabbed her, her eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe I am," she said softly, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Maybe I've always been the victim, Greg. Maybe I've been the victim of a loveless marriage, of a husband who was never really there." "Spare me the sob story," I snapped, stepping back. "You want to talk about being a victim? How about our kids, Jessica? How about Emma and Max, who are going to find out that their mother is a liar and a cheat? Don't you dare bring the kids into this," she warned, her voice low and threatening. "They have nothing to do with this. They have everything to do with this," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "You think this isn't going to tear them apart? You think they're not going to be affected by this? By your selfishness?" She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I was done. Done with the lies, done with the excuses, done with her. "You know what?" I said, my voice suddenly calm, almost detached. "I'm done. I'm done trying to make sense of this, done trying to understand how you could do this to us. I'm filing for divorce, Jessica, and I'm going to take everything from you. The house, the kids, everything." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by that same cold, defiant glare. "Good luck with that," she sneered. "You really think you're going to come out on top? You think the courts are going to side with you, the workaholic husband who was never home?" "I'm going to make sure they do," I said, my voice flat. "I've got everything I need to prove that you're an unfit mother. So go ahead. Keep seeing Ben. Keep sneaking around. But know this. I'm going to ruin you, Jessica. I'm going to make sure you lose everything." Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, glaring at me, her chest rising and falling with each angry breath. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out her next move. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a fight. Not anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, seething with rage. As I headed upstairs to the guest room, my room now, I could hear her muttering curses under her breath. But I didn't care. I was done. Done with the lies, done with the betrayal. All that was left was to figure out how to make good on my promise, how to make sure that Jessica paid for everything she'd done. After that explosive confrontation, the house was thick with tension, the air practically vibrating with the anger and betrayal between us. Jessica and I barely spoke to each other. When we did, it was in cold, clipped sentences that were more about avoiding each other than anything else. But I wasn't about to let her get away with what she'd done. No. If she thought she could humiliate me, destroy our family, and walk away unscathed, she was dead wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just sit back and take this. I couldn't just let her carry on with her little affair, pretending everything was normal while she made a fool out of me. I had to hit her where it hurt, make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. And that's when I decided. I was going to make her life a living hell, one small, calculated move at a time. The first thing I did was start messing with her routines. Jessica was a creature of habit. She liked things a certain way, always had. She had her daily rituals, her little comforts that kept her grounded. So I started to disrupt them, subtly at first. I'd move things around in the house, her makeup bag, her favorite coffee mug, her car keys, little things that would throw her off balance just enough to annoy her, but not enough to be obvious. She noticed almost immediately. "Greg, have you seen my keys?" she'd ask, her voice tinged with frustration as she tore through the kitchen drawers. I'd shrug, pretending to be engrossed in the morning paper. "Nope, haven't seen them." She'd huff and puff, eventually finding them in a place she swore she hadn't left them, shooting me a suspicious look as she rushed out the door. But she couldn't prove anything, and that's what made it so satisfying. Next, I took it a step further. Jessica was particular about her appearance, always had to look perfect before stepping out of the house. So I started sabotaging her makeup. Just a little at first. Switching her foundation for a shade too light, loosening the lids on her skincare bottles so they'd spill out when she opened them. She'd be in the bathroom cursing under her breath as her mascara smudged or her eyeliner ran, and I'd be downstairs hiding my smirk behind my coffee cup. But that wasn't enough. I needed something bigger. Something that would really shake her up. That's when I remembered her garden. Jessica's garden was her pride and joy. The one place she could escape to when she needed to clear her head. She spent hours out there tending to her flowers, pruning her shrubs, and fussing over every little detail. It was her sanctuary, and I was about to turn it into her nightmare. One night, after she'd gone to bed, I snuck out into the garden with a bottle of weed killer. I went to work, carefully spraying it on her prized roses, her hydrangeas, and her perfectly manicured lawn. It took everything in me not to laugh, as I imagined her reaction the next morning when she saw her precious garden wilting and brown, the flowers she'd nurtured for years curling up and dying right before her eyes. The next morning I watched from the window as she walked out to the garden, her usual cup of tea in hand. At first she didn't notice, but then she stopped dead in her tracks. I saw her drop the teacup, heard it shatter on the stone path as she rushed over to the roses, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the dead, crumbling petals. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened?" I could barely contain my satisfaction as I stepped outside, feigning concern. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice dripping with mock innocence. She spun around to face me, her eyes wide with panic. "My garden. It's dying. Everything's dying. I don't understand. I just fertilized last week. I water them every day. How could this happen?" I shrugged, pretending to examine the damage. Maybe it's some kind of disease or fungus. I've heard that can spread pretty quickly. Jessica looked like she was about to burst into tears, her hands clenched into fists as she stared at her ruined garden. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself. "It was fine yesterday. How could this happen overnight?" I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. "I'm sure it's nothing you did," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe you should call that landscaper you like. See if he can figure it out." She nodded, barely listening, her mind clearly racing as she knelt down to examine the roses. "Yeah, I'll do that," she mumbled, more to herself than to me. "I'll call him right now." She spent the rest of the day in a frenzy, on the phone with every gardening expert she could think of, pacing around the house like a madwoman, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I watched her unravel with a kind of twisted satisfaction, knowing that she had no idea it was all my doing. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing I had to do, something that would really drive home just how much control I had over her perfect little life. Jessica had always been protective of her image, especially on social media. She curated every post, every photo, to present the perfect life. The happy marriage, the beautiful kids, the flawless home. It was all a facade, of course, but it was a facade she was determined to maintain. So I decided to destroy it. I created a fake account on Instagram, using a throwaway email address, and started following her. I made it look like just another one of her fans, someone who admired her style, her taste. And then, when she least expected it, I started posting comments on her photos. Comments that hinted at the truth, that suggested there was more to her life than she was letting on. "Nice flowers, Jessica. Too bad they're not as perfect as they look. Is that the new dress you bought with Ben? Looks great on you. Wow, you and Greg look so happy. Must be nice to have such a loving husband." At first, she ignored the comments, probably thinking they were just from some troll. But as they kept coming, as they got more specific, more personal, she started to panic. I watched as she tried to delete the comments, as she blocked the account, only for me to create a new one and start all over again. She became paranoid, constantly checking her phone, deleting photos, locking down her accounts. She stopped posting altogether, too afraid that someone might say something that would expose her secrets. And the best part was, she had no idea who it was. She couldn't even look at me without a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, wondering if I knew, if I was behind it. It wasn't enough to just hurt her. I needed to make her feel as powerless as she'd made me feel. I needed her to understand that everything she thought she had, everything she thought she controlled, could be taken away in an instant. And it worked. Over the next few weeks, Jessica became a shell of the woman she used to be. She was jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder, checking her phone every few minutes like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She barely slept, barely ate, and every time she looked at me, there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. I knew she was starting to crack, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted her to feel like her world was falling apart, like there was nothing she could do to stop it, because that's how she'd made me feel. And now, she was getting a taste of her own medicine. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. There was still one more person who needed to pay for what they'd done. One more person who thought they could mess with my life and get away with it. And I was going to make sure he regretted ever laying a hand on my wife. As much as it had satisfied me to mess with Jessica's life, there was still one more piece of the puzzle that needed to be addressed. Ben. The smug bastard who thought he could sneak around with my wife behind my back. I wasn't about to let him get off scot-free. But I knew I had to be smart about it. No flying off the handle, no physical confrontations that could land me in trouble. No, I needed to hit Ben where it would really hurt, and I needed to do it in a way that was perfectly legal. I started with a little research. Ben wasn't exactly a stranger. I'd seen him around town a few times, usually with Jessica, though I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I knew he worked in real estate, one of those slick, overly confident types who made a living off selling overpriced houses to gullible buyers. From what I could gather, he was good at his job, had a decent reputation in the community, and liked to brag about his sales numbers on social media. It was all there, laid out for anyone to see. I figured the best way to get back at Ben was to hit him where it hurt most. His career. If there's one thing guys like him care about more than anything, it's their professional image. So, I decided to start there. I created a few fake profiles on Yelp, Google Reviews, and other real estate review sites. It wasn't hard to come up with a few bad reviews that would tarnish his otherwise pristine reputation. Unprofessional, I wrote in one review. Showed up late to our appointment, was dismissive of our needs, and seemed more interested in his phone than helping us find a home. Another review mentioned how he'd pressured the buyer into making a quick decision, only for them to later regret the purchase due to undisclosed issues with the property. The more I wrote, the more creative I got. Each review painted Ben as the worst kind of realtor, unreliable, pushy, and only interested in his commission. I made sure to spread the reviews out over different profiles and platforms, timing them so they wouldn't all appear at once. It was a slow burn, but over the course of a few weeks, the negative reviews started to add up, dragging his rating down and making potential clients think twice about hiring him. But that was just the beginning. I needed something bigger, something that would really shake him up. One day, while browsing through his social media, I noticed that Ben was particularly proud of an upcoming open house he was hosting for a high-end property. It was all over his Facebook and Instagram. Photos of the house, teasers about the event, invitations to potential buyers. He was clearly banking on this sale to boost his numbers and add another notch to his belt. That's when I got an idea. I figured if Ben was going to put so much effort into this open house, the least I could do was throw a wrench into his plans. A few days before the open house, I started posting on local community boards and real estate groups under another fake account. I posed as a disgruntled former client, warning people about Ben's shady business practices and advising them to steer clear of his upcoming open house. I didn't go overboard, just enough to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of potential buyers. I also made sure to mention a few key details about the house, details that only someone with inside knowledge would know, to make it more believable. But I didn't stop there. I also called the homeowners association in the neighborhood where the open house was taking place. Posing as a concerned neighbor, I expressed my worries about the unsavory types that Ben's open houses tended to attract. Loud, disruptive, and generally disrespectful to the community. I mentioned that I'd heard from a friend that Ben had a habit of leaving the properties unlocked after the open house, leading to potential security risks. The HOA took my concerns seriously and promised to keep an eye on things. The day of the open house arrived, and I made sure to swing by the neighborhood to see the fallout. From what I could tell, Ben had managed to draw a decent crowd, but there was definitely tension in the air. A few of the neighbors were out in their yards, glaring at the attendees as if they were about to rob the place. I even saw one of them approach Ben and give him an earful about the trouble he was bringing to their quiet community. I wasn't expecting a complete disaster, but it was enough to rattle him. I could see the frustration on his face, the way he was trying to keep it together as one thing after another went wrong. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was a victory nonetheless. And I knew that with the negative reviews piling up and the word starting to spread about his so-called business practices, Ben's career was going to take a hit. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing I wanted to do, something that would ensure Ben never looked at Jessica the same way again. I knew from their texts that Ben was under the impression that Jessica was trapped in a loveless marriage, that I was some kind of distant, uncaring husband who didn't appreciate her. It was clear he saw himself as her savior, the guy who could sweep her off her feet and make her feel alive again. It made me sick to think that he was playing the hero in their little fantasy. So I decided to show him just how trapped Jessica really was. I gathered up all the evidence I'd collected, photos of them together, screenshots of their messages, and a few of those incriminating social media comments I'd made under fake profiles, and put them together in a neat little package. Then, I composed an anonymous email and sent it to Ben. The email was simple. It congratulated him on his relationship with Jessica, mentioned how lucky he was to have found someone who was clearly so devoted to him, and then dropped the bombshell. Jessica had been playing both sides. The messages, the late-night meetups, the lies she'd told him about me, they were all part of her game. I hinted that Jessica was only using him to get back at me, that she'd never leave me because she needed the security I provided, and that as soon as she got bored, she'd move on to the next guy who could offer her a thrill. I didn't stop there. I made sure to include just enough details about their encounters, things only someone with inside knowledge could know, to make Ben question everything. I wanted him to wonder if Jessica had been lying to him from the start, if she was using him as a pawn in some twisted revenge plot. And I knew that if I played it right, he'd start to see the cracks in the facade she'd built up around their little fling. I didn't have to wait long for the results. A few days later, I saw Jessica storming around the house, her phone in hand, yelling into the receiver. "What the hell are you talking about?" she shouted, her voice dripping with frustration. "Where are you getting this from? Ben, I'm telling you, it's not true. You can't seriously believe—" She trailed off, her face pale with shock as she listened to whatever Ben was saying on the other end. She tried to explain, tried to smooth things over, but it was clear that Ben wasn't buying it. I could hear her growing more desperate, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to salvage whatever was left of their relationship, but it was no use. I'd planted the seed of doubt, and it was blossoming into full-blown paranoia. By the time she hung up, Jessica was a mess. She slumped down onto the couch, her head in her hands, looking like she was about to cry. I didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge that I'd heard the argument. I just sat back, watching as she fell apart, knowing that the damage was done. In the days that followed, I saw less and less of Jessica's usual sneaky behavior. She stopped going out late, stopped fussing over her appearance, and seemed to be in a constant state of agitation. I knew the relationship with Ben had hit the rocks, and it was only a matter of time before it imploded completely, and that was exactly what I wanted. Ben wasn't some innocent bystander who'd been caught up in Jessica's lies. He was just as guilty, just as complicit in the destruction of our marriage. But now, he was dealing with the fallout. Now he was the one left questioning everything, wondering if he'd been played by a woman who was only using him for her own twisted purposes. It was a small victory, but it was enough to satisfy me. I didn't need to beat Ben up, didn't need to confront him in some dramatic showdown. I just needed him to feel the same sense of betrayal and doubt that I'd been living with for weeks. And now, he did. With Jessica's affair in ruins and Ben's reputation taking a nosedive, I finally felt like I had some semblance of control back in my life. The anger, the betrayal, it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But at least now I could see a path forward. A path where I wasn't the victim, where I wasn't just some guy who got cheated on and left in the dust. I knew that the road ahead was going to be tough. There were still decisions to be made, still consequences to face. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the one calling the shots, like I had the power to decide what came next. And that, more than anything, was what I needed. After weeks of simmering tension and icy silence, the day finally came when we could no longer avoid the conversation. The house was quiet, the kids were at school, and the weight of everything that had happened hung between us like a thick, suffocating fog. We both knew what was coming, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it first. But it had to be done. I was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee, when Jessica walked in. She looked like hell, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and a kind of weariness that seemed to seep into her every movement. She hesitated at the doorway, as if debating whether to walk away, but then she sighed and stepped inside. "Greg," she started, her voice quieter than I was used to, lacking the edge it usually carried. "We need to talk." I set the mug down and turned to face her, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I guess we do." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I don't know how we got here," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. "I don't know how everything went so wrong." I wanted to lash out, to remind her that she was the one who had destroyed everything, but I bit my tongue. We'd already had enough of those arguments, and I was tired. Tired of the anger, tired of the blame. I just wanted to get this over with. "It doesn't matter how we got here, Jess," I said, my voice steady but cold. "What matters is where we go from here." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know," she whispered. "I know I've messed everything up. And I know I can't take it back." "You're right," I said bluntly. "You can't." She flinched at that, but she didn't argue. Instead, she finally said the words I'd been waiting for her to say. "Do you want a divorce?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me. I saw the woman I'd married, The woman I'd loved for 12 years, standing there with tears in her eyes, scared and broken. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite all the anger and hurt, a part of me still cared about her. But that part wasn't enough to fix what was broken. Yes, I said firmly, leaving no room for doubt. I want a divorce. Jessica closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as if trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. I figured, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew that's what you wanted. It's not about what I want, Jessica, I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. It's about what's best for both of us. This, whatever this is, it's not a marriage anymore. It's just two people who can't stand the sight of each other, living under the same roof out of obligation. She nodded again, her gaze still fixed on the floor. I know, she murmured. But what about the kids, Greg? What about Emma and Max? How do we explain this to them? That question had been gnawing at me for weeks, but I'd tried to push it to the back of my mind. I didn't have a good answer, and I knew that no matter how we framed it, this was going to hurt them. But I also knew that staying together for the kids' sake, while secretly despising each other, wasn't the answer. We'll tell them the truth, I said finally. We'll tell them that sometimes, even when two people love each other, things don't work out, that it's not their fault, and that we'll always be there for them, no matter what. Jessica looked up at me then, her eyes red and puffy. Do you think they'll understand? I don't know, I admitted. But I think they'll be okay eventually. Kids are resilient. They'll adjust, as long as we don't turn this into a war. A war, she repeated, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. That's what it feels like, doesn't it? Like we've been at war with each other for so long, we forgot what it's like to be on the same side. Maybe we have, I said quietly. But that's all the more reason to stop fighting and figure out a way forward. She took a deep breath, exhaling shakily as she tried to compose herself. Do you hate me, Greg? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you hate me for what I've done? I stared at her for a long moment, letting the question hang in the air. Did I hate her? The truth was, I didn't know. I hated what she'd done, hated the pain she'd caused, the trust she'd shattered. But did I hate her? The woman I'd shared my life with for over a decade? The mother of my children? I wasn't sure. I don't know, I said finally. I don't know if I hate you. I'm angry, Jess. I'm hurt. But I don't think I can say I hate you. She nodded, swallowing hard as she wiped away another tear. I'm sorry, Greg, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that her apology meant something, but it was too late for that. The damage was done, and no amount of sorry could fix it. I know you are, I said, my tone flat, but it doesn't change anything. She flinched again, like my words were physical blows, but she didn't argue. She knew, just as well as I did, that there was no going back from this. There was no way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. No way to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was. So, what now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? We figure out how to end this, I said, my voice steady, even though my heart felt like it was breaking all over again. We figure out how to divide everything, how to make sure the kids are taken care of. And then, we move on. Jessica nodded, a look of resigned acceptance in her eyes. Okay, she whispered. Okay, we'll do that. There was a long silence between us, the kind that feels like the end of something, and in a way it was. It was the end of our marriage, the end of everything we'd built together. But it was also the beginning of something new, something uncertain, something that neither of us could predict. I'll contact a lawyer, I said finally, breaking the silence. We'll keep it civil, for the kids' sake. Yeah, she agreed, her voice hollow. For the kids. We stood there for a moment longer, both of us lost in our own thoughts, in the memories of what used to be and the reality of what was. And then, without another word, Jessica turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone. As I watched her go, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but at the same time, it left me feeling empty, like I'd lost something I could never get back. But this was the right decision. It was the only decision. We couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep living this lie. And now that it was out in the open, now that we'd both acknowledged it, there was no turning back. It was time to end this chapter and figure out what came next. For me, for Jessica, and for our kids. After that final conversation, things moved quickly. It was like we both knew that dragging this out would only make it harder, especially for the kids. We'd already done enough damage, and the last thing we needed was a drawn-out, bitter battle, so we set to work dismantling the life we'd built together, dividing assets, making arrangements for the kids, and trying to figure out how to co-parent while living separate lives. I reached out to a lawyer the next day, someone I'd researched and felt confident could handle things fairly. I wasn't looking to ruin Jessica financially. I just wanted a clean break, something that would allow us both to move on without unnecessary drama. The lawyer was professional, efficient, and didn't waste time. We discussed my goals, keeping the house, securing joint custody of the kids, and ensuring that everything was as amicable as possible. Jessica, to her credit, didn't fight me on much. Maybe she was too tired, or maybe she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on after everything that had happened. Either way, she agreed to most of the terms without much pushback. We sat down together with our lawyers and went through the details. Who would get what, how we'd handle the holidays, how we'd explain everything to Emma and Max. It was surreal, sitting across from her in that sterile conference room, talking about the end of our marriage like it was just another business transaction, but it had to be done. The house was the first big decision. It had been our home for over a decade, the place where we'd raised our kids, shared our lives. But now it was just another asset to be divided. Jessica didn't want to keep it. Too many memories, she said. She wanted a fresh start somewhere else, a smaller place where she could start over. I offered to buy her out, to keep the house for the sake of stability for the kids. She agreed, and the process was set in motion. Then there was the matter of custody. This was the part that weighed on me the most. Emma and Max had already sensed that something was wrong. Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for. But now we had to explain to them that Mom and Dad weren't going to be living together anymore. We both knew it was going to be tough, and we wanted to handle it as delicately as possible. We decided on joint custody, with the kids splitting their time between us. I would keep them during the school week, and Jessica would have them on weekends. Holidays would be alternated, and we both agreed to be flexible for the sake of the kids. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. Our lawyers drew up the paperwork, and within a few weeks, everything was finalized. Then came the hardest part, telling the kids. We sat them down in the living room, on the same couch where we used to watch movies together as a family. Jessica and I had practiced what we would say, but when the moment came, it was still agonizing. Emma and Max looked at us with wide, innocent eyes, and I could see the fear and confusion starting to build as they sensed what was coming. Mom and Dad have something important to talk to you about, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. We love you both very much, and that will never change. But sometimes, even when two people care about each other, they can't stay together the way they used to. Emma, who was always the more sensitive one, immediately started to tear up. Are you getting a divorce? She asked, her voice trembling. Jessica nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Yes, sweetie, we are. But that doesn't mean we don't love you or that it's your fault. This is something between me and Daddy, and we've decided that it's best for us to live in different houses. Max, who was quieter, just sat there staring at the floor. He didn't say anything, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. I reached out and pulled him into a hug, trying to reassure him. It's going to be okay, buddy, I said softly. You'll still see both of us all the time. We'll just be living in different places, that's all. Emma started to cry, and Jessica pulled her into her arms, whispering that everything was going to be all right, that we were still a family, no matter what. But I could see that it wasn't enough. How could it be? We were tearing their world apart, and no amount of comforting words was going to change that. For the next few days, the atmosphere in the house was heavy, like everyone was walking on eggshells. Emma and Max were subdued, quieter than usual, and Jessica and I did our best to keep things as normal as possible. But there was no getting around it. Everything had changed. The first night Jessica moved out was the hardest. We'd spent the day packing up her things, loading them into the car, and preparing the kids for the transition. Emma clung to her mother like she didn't want to let go, while Max tried to be brave, even though I could see he was struggling. When it was time for Jessica to leave, there was a moment of awkwardness, like neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she knelt down in front of the kids, hugged them tight, and promised that they'd see her in a couple of days. Then she turned to me. There was a moment where I thought she might say something to acknowledge what we'd lost, what we'd been through. But in the end, she just gave me a sad, tired smile and said, "Take care, Greg." "You too," I replied. And with that, she was gone. The next few weeks were a blur of adjustments, getting used to the new schedule with the kids, figuring out how to manage the house on my own, trying to navigate this new reality. Jessica and I kept our interactions brief and to the point, mostly about logistics with the kids. There was no point in rehashing what had happened. We both knew where we stood. The kids were resilient, just like I'd hoped. They adjusted to the new routine, though there were still moments when I could see the sadness in their eyes. Emma, in particular, had a hard time with it. She'd always been close to her mother, and I knew she was struggling with the idea of our family being split up. We had long talks, just the two of us, where she'd ask why this had to happen, and I'd do my best to explain it in a way that a 10-year-old could understand. Max was quieter, more introspective. He didn't ask as many questions, but I knew he was processing everything in his own way. I made a point of spending extra time with him, taking him out for ice cream, playing video games with him, trying to keep his mind off the changes. It was tough, but we were getting through it, one day at a time. Jessica was doing the same on her end. I knew from the kids that she was struggling too, trying to make her new place feel like home, trying to keep things normal for them when they were with her. We both knew this wasn't what we wanted for them, but we also knew it was better than the alternative, staying in a marriage that was already broken beyond repair. It wasn't until a few months later that the dust finally started to settle. The kids were more comfortable with the new routine. The awkwardness between Jessica and me had faded into something resembling civility, and I was starting to find my footing as a single dad. It wasn't easy, but it was manageable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life again. One evening, after I'd put the kids to bed, I found myself sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the yard where they used to play. The house was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just sit and think about everything that had happened. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt. It was all still there, buried deep, but it didn't consume me like it once did. I knew I'd made the right decision, for myself, for the kids, and even for Jessica. We couldn't go back, and trying to hold on to something that was already gone would have only made things worse. As I sat there, I realized that despite everything, I was starting to feel lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. There was still a long road ahead, still challenges to face, but I was ready for them. I had my kids, I had my home, and I had the knowledge that I'd done what was best for all of us, and that was enough. The months that followed the divorce were a strange mix of freedom and uncertainty. There were days when I felt like a new man, unburdened by the toxic relationship that had weighed me down for so long. And then there were days when the loneliness would creep in, reminding me of the life I'd lost, the family I'd once imagined I'd have forever. But despite the ups and downs, life started to move forward. The kids were adjusting well, which was my main concern. Emma had joined a soccer team and was making new friends, while Max had thrown himself into his love for building models, something we started doing together on weekends. They still asked questions about why things had to change, but those questions became less frequent, and their laughter became more common. I took that as a sign that we were all healing in our own way. I threw myself into my work more than ever, not just as a distraction, but as a way to rebuild the parts of my life that had crumbled. I took on more projects, stayed later at the office, and even started leading a few initiatives that I'd always been too distracted to pursue. The focus helped, and the satisfaction of seeing things come together in a professional sense made the days feel purposeful again. But work wasn't everything. I knew I needed more, something to fill the void that Jessica's betrayal had left behind. So, I started doing things I hadn't done in years, things that I'd put on hold because of the demands of family life. I reconnected with old friends, guys I hadn't seen since college. We'd meet up for drinks, catch a game, or just hang out like we used to, back before life got so complicated. It felt good to be around people who didn't know me as just Greg the husband or Greg the dad, but as Greg, the guy who loved hiking, classic rock, and a good bourbon. These nights out reminded me that there was still a person inside me who had passions, interests, and desires outside of the roles I'd been playing for so long. One of those nights out led me to an old passion I'd almost forgotten about: music. Before the kids, before the responsibilities piled up, I used to play guitar. Nothing serious, just jamming with friends or playing at small gigs. I hadn't picked up a guitar in years, but one evening, after a few drinks and some reminiscing, I found myself wandering into a local music shop. I don't know what drew me in, but the smell of polished wood and the sight of gleaming instruments brought back memories I hadn't realized I was missing. I ended up buying a used acoustic, something to fool around with at home. At first, it was just to see if I still had it in me, but the more I played, the more I felt like I was reconnecting with a part of myself that had been buried under the rubble of my old life. Playing music became a kind of therapy for me. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, strumming out tunes as the sun set, letting the music wash away the day's stress. The kids loved it too. Emma would sing along while Max tried to keep time on an old tambourine I'd found in the attic. Those were the moments when I felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. As time passed, I started thinking about what it meant to move on, really move on. I wasn't ready to jump into another relationship. That much I knew. The wounds from Jessica's betrayal were still too raw, and the idea of trusting someone again seemed almost impossible. But I also knew that I couldn't close myself off forever. So, I started slow. I joined a few online forums for divorced dads, just to see how others were coping. It was surprisingly helpful, hearing from guys who'd been through the same thing, who understood the struggles and the triumphs that came with starting over. It gave me a sense of community, a feeling that I wasn't alone in this journey. Eventually, those forums led to something I hadn't expected: dating. It wasn't something I jumped into eagerly. Hell, the idea of putting myself out there again was terrifying. But the more I talked to other guys who had done it, the more I realized that maybe it was worth a shot. Maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. My first date was awkward, to say the least. I'd met her online, Sarah, a teacher with 2 kids of her own. We had dinner at a small Italian place downtown, and the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I was out of my depth. We talked about our kids, our jobs, the usual first date stuff, but I could tell we were both holding back, both scarred by our pasts. Still, it was nice to have someone to talk to, someone who understood the baggage I was carrying. We went on a few more dates, and while it didn't turn into anything serious, it was a start. It was proof that I could do this, that I could open myself up to new experiences, new people, without being crushed by the weight of my past. Sarah and I stayed in touch as friends, and that was enough for now. But the real turning point came when I started thinking about the future, not just in terms of relationships, but in terms of who I wanted to be, what I wanted my life to look like. The divorce had been a wake-up call, a reminder that life is unpredictable and that nothing is guaranteed. It made me realize that I needed to start living for myself, not just for my kids or for the expectations I'd placed on myself over the years. So, I made some changes. I started taking care of myself, physically, mentally, emotionally. I hit the gym more regularly, not just to blow off steam, but to feel good in my own skin again. I started eating better, cutting back on the junk food and late-night snacks that had become a crutch during the worst of the divorce. I even started meditating, something I'd always scoffed at but found surprisingly calming. And then there was the house. The place that had once felt like a prison of memories now felt like a blank slate, a canvas for a new beginning. I started making small changes, repainting the walls, rearranging the furniture, getting rid of the stuff that no longer served me. It was a way of reclaiming the space, of making it mine again. The kids noticed the changes too. They saw me smiling more, laughing more, being present in a way I hadn't been in years. We started making new traditions: movie nights, weekend hikes, Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. It wasn't the same as before, but it was ours, and that made it special. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I sat down with a beer on the porch, the guitar in my lap, and started playing one of the old tunes I used to love. The kids were inside watching TV, the sound of their laughter drifting out through the open windows. As I strummed the chords, I realized that I wasn't just playing music. I was reclaiming a part of myself that I thought I'd lost. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just surviving. I was rebuilding. I was creating a new life, a life that was mine, on my terms. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the loneliness crept in, but I was learning to live with it, to push through it. I was learning to be okay with the uncertainty, the unknown, and to trust that I had the strength to face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden light, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The past was still there, a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was moving forward, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, and that was enough. Enough to keep going, enough to keep pushing through the hard days, enough to believe that better days were ahead. Because I wasn't just the guy whose wife cheated on him. I was Greg, the father, the musician, the man who had faced his demons and come out the other side stronger. And that was who I was going to be from now on.